Ideas don't build the modern world. Politics don't. Even innovation doesn't. Energy does. For over a century, cheap energy was the silent foundation under every factory, every city, every supply chain, every home. Our entire way of life was built because the cost of powering it was low, stable, and predictable. Or that foundation is cracking. Not because we're running out of energy, not because technology failed, but because the very systems that made energy cheap no longer work the way they were designed to. This is the story of how cheap energy ended. Not emotionally, not ideologically. Structurally, modern prosperity has a simple architecture. When energy is cheap, manufacturing expands, transportation is efficient, food becomes affordable, infrastructure grows, and globalization accelerates. Cheap energy wasn't a luxury. It was the baseline assumption of advanced economies. But assumptions have an expiration date, and this one is reaching its limit. For most of the 20th century, oil was the perfect fuel for the economy. It's incredibly dense with energy, easy to transport, easy to store, and highly profitable. It fueled everything: our cars, our trucks, our ships, our planes, our fertilizers, our plastics, and the entire global supply system. But the stability of oil prices wasn't natural. It was engineered through geopolitical partnerships, concentrated production, strategic reserves, and tightly controlled supply chains. Cheap oil was constructed. And now, that construction is weakening. The United States and Europe relied on a global system where a few regions extracted energy, a larger number consumed it, and a handful of institutions kept it stable. But two massive forces changed everything. First, demand for energy grew much faster than new supply could come online. Second, the cheapest, easiest to reach sources of oil and gas were used up first. This is a basic rule of resource economics. You get the easy barrels first, and the expensive barrels later. For decades, we benefited from massive low-cost fields in the North Sea, Texas, Alaska, and the Middle East. But as those conventional fields aged, getting oil became more expensive. We had to drill deeper, go further offshore, and use complex technologies like fracking. Energy didn't become scarce. Cheap energy did. Europe faced a different but related structural problem. Its powerful industrial economy relied heavily on imported natural gas, especially from pipelines connecting Russia to the rest of the continent. For 20 years, this was the secret to European competitiveness: cheap, stable, and abundant gas that kept factories humming and homes warm. Then, in 2022, the system broke. Gas became volatile, infrastructure was disrupted, and prices spiked to historic levels. The crisis didn't happen because Europe ran out of gas. It happened because Europe ran out of stable gas. And stability is the invisible ingredient of cheap energy. Once it disappears, affordability disappears with it. Electricity tells a similar story. For decades, our grids were powered by cheap coal, cheap hydro, and nuclear power, which is cheap once it's built. But coal declined for environmental reasons. Nuclear stagnated due to high costs, political resistance, and complex regulations. Hydropower reached its geographical limits. Into this gap came solar and wind. They're clean, they're scalable, and they're technological marvels. But they have two major structural constraints. First, intermittency. The sun doesn't always shine, and the wind doesn't always blow. Second, storage. Storing massive amounts of energy for when it's needed is still incredibly expensive. This doesn't mean renewables are a bad idea. It just means they require a complete redesign of our energy infrastructure: new transmission lines, massive storage systems, and backup capacity. This transition increases costs in the short and medium term. The guarantee of cheap electricity is gone. Food prices reflect this same fragility. Modern agriculture isn't really powered by sunlight. It's powered by energy. Fertilizers, refrigeration, irrigation, diesel for tractors, and global shipping all depend on it. So when energy becomes expensive or volatile, food prices follow. That's why you see global food inflation tracking so closely with energy inflation. The path is simple. Energy costs affect logistics, which affect agriculture, which affects your grocery bill. Cheap food was never a miracle of nature. It was a byproduct of cheap energy. Supply chains are another perfect example. Before 2020, the global shipping system was built on three assumptions: stable fuel prices, stable ports, and stable demand. All three broke at once. Fuel prices went wild, shipping lanes were disrupted, ports got congested, and shortages of parts and labor became common. Suddenly, the cost of moving goods, producing goods, and even storing goods skyrocketed. The modern supply chain was built for a world of cheap energy and predictable conditions. When either one fails, everything gets expensive. So why didn't our economies adapt faster? Because energy systems have incredibly long timelines. An oil project takes years of exploration and drilling. A nuclear plant can take over a decade to go from design to operation. Even building out renewables requires massive upgrades to our grids that take time. For more than a decade, global investment in oil, gas, nuclear, and grid expansion stagnated. Not because the world didn't need more energy, but because everyone just assumed prices would stay stable forever. They didn't. Then came the shift that many people overlooked. We hit the plateau of cheap baseload power. Baseload is the constant. Minimum amount of electricity needed to keep society running 24/7. It powers our hospitals, our factories, our data centers, and our cities while we sleep. Historically, this cheap baseload power came from coal, gas, and nuclear. But today, coal is being phased out, gas is volatile, and nuclear has stagnated. Baseload power didn't disappear. Cheap baseload power did. Electric vehicles perfectly illustrate the complexity of this transition. They reduce our demand for oil, which is great, but they dramatically increase our demand for electricity. They also require massive amounts of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper minerals that are geographically concentrated and energy-intensive to extract. So, the transition away from fossil fuels reduces our dependence on oil, but it increases our dependence on minerals and a strained electrical grid. This isn't a failure. It's a structural trade-off. Every energy transition in history has created its own new constraints. The final trend shows up in our household budgets. For decades, the share of our income that we spent on energy was falling. Today, it's rising again. Gasoline, electricity, heating, cooling, food, transportation, it's all getting more expensive. This isn't temporary inflation. It is structural. It's happening not because energy is running out, but because the very systems that kept it cheap are no longer stable. Three powerful forces will define our energy future. First, volatility. Prices will fluctuate more wildly because supply chains are stretched thin. Second, infrastructure gaps. Our grids, pipelines, and power plants all need massive, expensive modernization. And third, transition costs. Moving to a new energy system means we have to pay for both the old and the new at the same time for decades. This doesn't mean collapse. It means recalibration. Energy is no longer something we can just assume will be there. It's something that must be managed. It is priced, not guaranteed. It is strategic, not invisible. The era of cheap energy was a temporary gift. It depended on abundant resources, stable geopolitics, and infrastructure that was never truly tested. All five of those conditions have changed. And when the foundational assumptions of a system change, the system itself must change with them. But there is one energy source that completely contradicts this narrative of scarcity. A source that's old, misunderstood, and more powerful than anything else we've ever built: nuclear energy. For decades, nuclear has carried a heavy cultural burden. Accidents, politics, and fear have shaped a narrative that has more to do with emotion than with statistics. But structurally, the numbers are crystal clear. Nuclear produces more energy per gram of fuel than any other source. It delivers stable 24/7 baseload power regardless of the weather. It has the lowest carbon footprint of any major energy source, and a single uranium fuel pellet, the size of your fingertip, stores as much energy as a ton of coal or nearly 150 gallons of oil. This isn't theory, it's physics. And when energy becomes scarce, physics matters more than politics. But nuclear power stalled. Not because it failed as a technology, but because other sources won the race for different reasons. Cheap fossil fuels won the economic race. Renewables won the cultural race. And nuclear, which won the technical race, ultimately lost the narrative. The result? The world built solar for speed, wind for scale, gas for flexibility, and it neglected the one source built for stability. Ironically, as energy becomes more expensive, the very source designed to be abundant, dense, and predictable is the one we underbuilt. Yet in every serious long-term projection, the same conclusion appears. As cheap energy disappears, nuclear becomes not just an option, but a structural necessity. The end of cheap energy is not the end of prosperity. It is the end of a particular kind of prosperity, one built on the illusion of infinite low-cost resources. The real question isn't whether we're running out of energy. The real question is, what happens to a world built on cheap energy when cheap energy becomes the exception instead of the rule? Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown insightful, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the systems that shape our world.